Welcome to Coast Vue, the show that every single day celebrates the men and women who are making coastal Mississippi such a great place to live, work, and play. I mentioned last week that I had the opportunity to speak to the Leadership Gulf Coast Leadership Gulf Coast is a really important leadership development program for the Mississippi Gulf Coast Chamber of Commerce, and they had what is called their annual Leadership Gulf Coast Alumni Breakfast. And they had classes from back in the early 90s through the most recent class comes together. And it's a great networking opportunity. It's a great chance for these people that spent a year together in a development program to say hello to each other. It's kind of cool to see them when they come together because they as Adele said last week, they develop sort of a lifetime of membership because they go through this offsite team building exercise and they get to see what's happening across coastal Mississippi, so many important things. And I had the opportunity to be their featured speaker this year. And I spent a lot of time thinking about it. And as I mentioned last week, sort of the basis of my talk was that I had a chance to participate in a program at Northwestern. And our final graduation speaker was a man who was the chairman of the board for the Hearst Corporation that owns the San Francisco Chronicle. And one of the things he said is the thing he said that I never will forget. We left our whole group literally spellbound. But what he said was there's a powerful lubrication to change that comes from pain, that pain is a powerful lubricant. And whether it be in your personal life, your business life, in the community life, I referred a lot to Katrina because in Katrina there was this explosion of pain across every dimension. And what we observed in ourselves and our leadership at Coastal Mississippi was incredibly inspiring. We learned that we could be superhuman. We learned that we are unbelievably resilient when we were pressed. And look at what we accomplished. Look where Coastal Mississippi is today. I mean, to me, that's our competitive advantage. But one of the things that I said is that we have so many things to think about. And I was just trying to draw so many sort of dimensions of the things we have to think about, from the homeless community to food shelters to some macroeconomic numbers that we should pay attention to. But one of the things I mentioned is something I've said here on the show many times, and that is that we have a tendency to be complacent. When you get us to a certain level of success, certainly our recovery from Katrina is a significant success story. It's not unusual to take a pause. It's not unusual to say, okay, we've gotten to this point. And one of the things that my friend Jerry St. Pé, the former CEO of Ingalls, has said many times, and I'm super compelled by what he says, and that is that we should always fight complacency. We should not take for granted, for example, that Chevron will always be there and that Ingalls will always be there. And the purpose of today's show is this part, which is that the blue chip industries that are part of Stennis Space Center are always going to be there. We cannot take that for granted. We have to be very focused on making sure that we support all of their efforts, both at the state level and in Congress. What the Stennis Space Center is in specifically, not only is it important as an element to the economic engine that drives coastal Mississippi and the state, but it's international importance. It certainly is important to our nation and the space mission of our nation. What's going on there, if you haven't paid attention to it, maybe you don't know about it, is unbelievably important to our nation. And so today's show is going to be spending some time talking about Stennis Space Center, this unique relationship it has with the Michoud facility over in Louisiana. And I've asked my friend Mark Glorioso, who's the chairman of Partners for Stennis and Michoud, to rejoin us. So we had him on the show with Tish not long ago. We're going to tell his unique NASA story, but we're also going to talk about why we shouldn't take Stennis for granted. So without any further ado, let me go over to my friend Mark Glorioso and just say good morning. How you doing, Mark? I think you're muted, Mark. Check your mic. Check your mic. That's okay. No problem at all.
Of course I am.
There you go. Go ahead. Yeah. So how you doing this morning, my friend?
Wonderful. And thank you for having me on the show. It is a real joy to be here.
It's good to see you back, man. You had a great history, great story with Stennis, with NASA, and well, with Stennis as well, I might add. But we'll come back to that in just a second. But let's do this at a very high level, because we'll tell sort of the Stennis story at various parts during our conversation today. But talk about just kind of briefly the Partners for Stennis and Michaud and what that organization is all about.
Well, the Partners for Stennis and Michaud basically has organized 27 years ago to advance businesses in the region through the Stennis Space Center and the Michaud Assembly Facility. It really is a group that represent American taxpayers that are committed to continued national investment in space exploration. It's about, at this time, 250 members, and it is open membership to any individual, company, organization, or other legitimate business entity with an interest in furthering the development of Stennis and MAF region. That's important because we have set up many opportunities to speak to the legislators in Jackson, to the governor himself, to the United States House of Representatives and Senate, and we are given the opportunity to attend meetings there. I'll talk a little bit about some of those meetings, but mostly I wanted to say that we are comprised of membership that include Aerojet Rocketdyne, Coast Electric, Hancock Chamber of Commerce. We have a small company named Bay Life Gifts at Century Hall that I mentioned as a representative of the small retail organizations that may be involved with us. We also have, and I have my notes here, of course. There it is.
Yes, fine, no problem.
Aerojet Rocketdyne, as I mentioned, Rolls-Royce is a member, Boeing, Blue Origin, Rocket Lab, and Relativity Space, who I will bring up later to talk about, and their commercial partnerships with NASA. And the list just goes on with who's in our organization. We basically hold 4 major events a year. We have Capitol Day in Jackson, where the partners and the people from NASA go together and speak with the legislators. We always get invited onto the floor. NASA does. Sometimes we're invited as well, but NASA goes on the floor. They usually get an award for great things that are going, and I'll talk a little bit about that after I finish with the partners. And they have opportunities to speak with the governor, as I said, and there's just this on the floor of the rotunda. We bring in numerous entities that pass out information and, dare I say, lobby with the legislators.
Yeah.
We also do an annual center directors briefing, which coincidentally is coming up tomorrow, where the director of Stennis Space Center, Dr. Rick Gilbreth, will address some 100+ members at PRCC, Pearl River Community College, tomorrow. They're hosting us. So the center director has been very instrumental in helping to bring in Relativity Space and Rocket Lab, which again we'll talk about. He's also got plans for the future with NASA, and we're very pleased that we have that partnership with him. The Citizens for Space Exploration always includes us. It's like a national organization, and we recently just returned from the D.C. fly-in, where we met with, as I said, the Senate and the House representatives, and we talked very specifically about what's going on at Stennis and Michaud. It's a big boon for this area when we can do that kind of work. And then, of course, we have quarterly meetings where we get together and we have various speakers come in, and we just had one of those back in December, and we got one coming up. And it's, like I said, it's a very exciting organization, and I'm extremely proud to be the chairman of this organization.
Well, that's awesome, Mark. One of the things that we'll talk about when we get on the other side, or we're coming to an end on this particular segment. So I want to come back on the other side and talk about why all these new partners are coming to the table about the changing mission of the Stennis Space Center, the changing sort of mission of our goals in space, sort of the privatization of space and space flight and all that. And then we'll shift gears and go back a little bit in your past to talk about the incredible work that you were involved in at NASA. But when we come back, we'll continue our conversation with Mark Glorioso, who's the chairman of the Partners for Stennis and Michaud. And this show today is about learning more about Stennis, so we do not take it for granted. We'll see you on the other side. For the general public who doesn't really appreciate what Stennis is all about, you got to go back in history and pretty far back and think about senators like John Stennis and some of the sort of forefathers of the leadership in coastal Mississippi. There was this vision to create this place that for rocket testing that had incredible buffer zones. I mean, you know, when I think about that, Mark Glorioso, who's chairman of Partners for Stennis and Michaud, the vision they had to go in there and create so much land for a buffer zone, because encroachment, when you do rocket testing and other types of testing that take place, the encroachment on neighbors can be very significant. So this buffer zone is really, really important. When you reflect on our forefathers in this community and John Stennis and what they created when they created Stennis Space Center, man, it took vision to do that, didn't it?
Well, absolutely. And in fact, part of that vision is interesting. There's folklore that I like to throw out. You know, in the early days when Dr. von Braun was speaking to the Congress about why we're going to the moon, you know, there's a legend, and I can't verify it, even though a search would probably do so. And he was asked, Dr. von Braun, just what do you expect to find when you get to the moon? And he just very clearly said, Russians. And I think that kind of started us down a path of being the main premier space exploration country. And again, later, he is quoted as saying, I don't know yet what method we'll get to the moon, but we have to go through South Mississippi to do so. So you had a lot of politics driving from, as you said, John Stennis to push it down here. But then the technical capabilities took over after the politics kind of led it here. We needed the land. We needed the rolling hills. We needed the timber, because what we saw at the Marshall Space Flight Center was the fence line was the edge, and people moved in, and they can't test the kind of stuff that we can test here. So,
encroachment and the conversation around encroachment. But they saw it back then. That's what's so amazing. And challenged by John Kennedy, that we were going to put a man on the moon. And when you think back now, Mark, at how fast that timeline rolled out, it's truly remarkable. It shows what happens when we get the smartest people in our nation together with a goal that we could accomplish what we accomplished. It's really, truly remarkable, isn't it?
Well, especially when you reflect on the Apollo 1 fire that took the lives of the first 3 astronauts. The interesting thing, and I'm going to plug my father a little bit, my dad, Sam Glorioso, worked at the Johnson Space Center before me. So when we get to my career, he kind of influenced me to want to work there. And he was instrumental in the materials that we selected to fix the problem that caused the fire. I say that because that is one little piece of a major technical hurdle that we had to get through to get to the moon. And they did it in just 9 years. That's just unheard of.
Well, I've had the opportunity. Fred Hayes and I got to know each other some when I was publisher of the newspaper. But as we know now, we've actually erected a statue in his honor in Biloxi. He's a Biloxi boy. And we spent an hour together on Coast Vue talking about his growing up, being a paper boy at one time. It's interesting. He was a paper boy. So was I. I became publisher of the Sun Herald. But we reflected on the incredible people that he worked around. And even with Apollo 13, where they had the challenges they had, of course, the movie brought incredible light to, we didn't have a lot of the tools we have today, doing long math, for example, to figure out trajectories and things like this. I think it was a great education for the average person to recognize how we were able to overcome the lack of some technology, a lot of technology, frankly, to be able to make that mission work. But then you fast forward, you get into you get into further exploration, the work that we did with the shuttle fleet, and the work that you did on that. It's just incredible the role that Stennis has played. And now today we have the changing mission of NASA. How do you describe that when you talk to people?
Well, I look at the evolution of the space exploration as we went from the Saturn V, which was very intentionally built to go to the moon, to a space shuttle that was made to get mass up into low Earth orbit that we could assemble and that we could carry payloads. It had a great mission. It didn't quite come to the fruition of the way we planned it, but that story is too long and involved. But it did accomplish many things. We built the space station out of it that is an ongoing until 2030 operational vehicle that NASA manages. As we evolve past the space shuttle into realizing it is not the most cost-effective way to get to low Earth orbit, especially when we saw the likes of SpaceX and Blue Origin and others who started competing. The government does not compete with commercial industry. It's not supposed to, and why would we? So we refocused our mission on the exploration that we want to do, relying on now SpaceX for sure, and soon to be Blue Origin and others, Lockheed, etc., to getting not only cargo, but human beings to low Earth orbit. Everything launches from low Earth orbit once you get there. So we also see that, well, in my crystal ball, I think that the Artemis vehicle will eventually evolve to a commercial vehicle that NASA will not own and manage, but we need to manage it and get it ready to go to the moon and to Mars. The commercial need to go there isn't there yet. But these are where these evolutions have taken place. And when the shuttle program was ended, it marked a huge change at Stennis, because we went from flying all of these shuttles, testing 3 engines for every launch, to 1 Artemis launch a year, testing 4 engines. So for 1 launch a year. So it's dwindled a little bit. And again, as I mentioned, the center director and what he has done to bring in some of this commercial work to try and help Stennis to be preeminent still in all of space exploration.
Yeah, it's amazing to watch as free enterprise, competition, innovation, the years of experience at NASA, all these things start to merge, and Stennis continues to find this relevant role in the future of spaceflight. And one of the reasons why is because the leaders that helped create that field there, the Stennis Space Center, and their vision to create this incredible buffer zone, sort of like, and the fact that we're not doing anything to encroach upon that has almost like galvanized Stennis's role in spaceflight from this point forward. It's just an amazing story. Let's take a step back for a second, Mark. When did you realize that space flight was going to be something that you were going to literally dedicate your life to?
Interesting. My first realization was in 1971. In the early 60s, I clipped every article about space. I said my dad worked at Johnson Space Center, and that piqued my interest. Now, I took a little bit of a side road in high school and became a musician. But it didn't take me long on the road of being a musician to say my love is in engineering and science. And so I went back to school. And of course, my dad was instrumental in getting me there. And when I first started, he said, "Boy, you don't like math." Well, turned out I loved math. And I got my undergraduate degree in University of Houston in electrical engineering. I got my master's degree in physics at the University of Houston. And I fell in love with space again as I was studying when I was 20. And there was just no stopping at that point. I was going to work for NASA, even though I had to step through a job at a contractor to get there. And I loved every minute of it.
Hey, incidentally, I think I remember this right. Mayor Fofo Gillis from Biloxi has a mathematics major, and he ultimately opened up a software development company. I think he went to the University of Houston as well, actually. So really, really, really smart guy. Really smart guy.
Awesome. I loved U of H.
Yeah.
I'm an alumni, and I lived in Houston, and it was a good, cost-effective education. And
Yeah.
I just encourage everyone, find the most cost-effective education that you can and get a skill.
And pursue it. So what year did you land inside NASA?
1984.
Wow.
And I started doing database work to keep up with every connector on the space shuttle. And this was when RBase 4000 was the new spreadsheet, and it was all we had. And I had the first IBM PC with 2 floppy disks, NASA owned. And I worked at JSC, and I built up that database. And the second thing I did was use that PC to convert 36-bit UNIVAC data tapes into 32-bit data tapes, which became the standard. And that was just as a contractor, and NASA liked what I did and hired me.
That's awesome. Listen, we're talking to Mark Glorioso. He's the chairman of Partners for Stennis and Michaud. And, we talked a little bit about that organization at the beginning. We're going to finish a little bit more about his career at NASA so you can get a sense of the kind of people who are involved in these efforts. And then we'll circle back and talk about Stennis specifically, the kind of companies that are there, the kind of work that they're doing, the future of Stennis. We'll see you after this. As I said in my speech last year at the One Coast Awards, and then last week at the Leadership Gulf Coast Alumni Breakfast, I kind of took Jerry St. Pay's lead, because Jerry said in one of our shows here on Coast View in the early days of Coast View that one of his biggest concerns is that we're going to get complacent, that we will always think that Ingalls and Chevron will always be there, and that the blue chip industries that are part of Stennis will always be there. And we cannot take those things for granted. Those are important engines that help make coastal Mississippi the economic engine for Mississippi. But it doesn't happen if we aren't aligned and don't work hard on every level of government, every private sector level, and even in the public, to make sure people understand what's happening there, because it has a tendency to be out of sight, out of mind. So I'm visiting with my friend Mark Glorioso, who is the chairman for Partners for Stennis and Michaud. And when we went to break, we're talking a bit about his career. He did some important computer work for a contractor. He did such a good job. It kind of became a standard for NASA, the work that he was doing, that NASA ultimately hired him. And that's kind of where we are in Mark's story. So, Mark, it had to have been a big day in your career to now actually be able to say you worked for NASA when you did.
Yeah, and as a young family man with 2 kids, when I made the transfer and my salary dropped by $8,000 a year, it was a difficult decision, but it made itself. And ultimately, I joined in the audio department. That's where they had the opening. And I worked on speech recognition. We worked with partners such as DARPA and others out of Huntsville, Alabama, to develop the first speech recognition technologies. Now, why is that applied in space? Well, we thought we may want to integrate that later on. Well, when you pick up your phone and talk to Siri, I just want you to know, me and 5 of my closest friends pioneered that technology, and it has taken off, as you well know. My career just moved through so many things. It seemed like every 3 years I got a phone call from the boss or the boss's boss and said, hey, we got this other thing we want you to do. And I jumped on it. And my next job was to manage all of the communications and tracking equipment that's flying on the space station right now. Which to me was just amazing. There were 6 systems, and I was the program manager at the ripe old age of 30, and thought, wow, this is what the guys that went to the moon did. They were young. They were really into the new technology. And what we built and fly is about 90% what we developed. I even wrote software to do automatic flight detection, isolation, and recovery, because we knew we couldn't have people sitting in the control center watching this thing bore holes in the sky for 40 years. So little things like that were just pioneering, and now you can go click on Chat GPT and talk to your computer and get all the information you want. It can help you find things. This is all kind of spin-off technology, including microwaves and cell phones. Now, I won't say that without NASA they wouldn't get developed, but I will say that with NASA they came much quicker.
You know, what was interesting to me, actually, a few years ago, and it bore out of learning more about Stennis as a publisher, that I started to really understand the kind of innovation and R&D that was happening inside of NASA. And you mentioned the point about voice recognition, which is a significant contribution to humanity. But you know, there's a long list of technologies that have rolled out of NASA that have been about improving our lives. So you're doing it for space flight, but innovation is what innovation is, man. It has a way of transforming and leapfrogging current capabilities, and it helps humanity. I mean, there's a long list of those kind of examples, aren't there?
Yeah, as a matter of fact, I even brought a few because I think it's more than just the tangible hardware that gets produced. In leadership, we have developed new ways of leading large programs and projects. We've got education that we are so interested in trying to move STEM education. This whole diversity of thought and bringing in people of all races and genders together to try and come up with the best solutions to all future problems. Innovation and jobs, you mentioned it, but we have jobs that are made to innovate. I mean, I was working on speech recognition that wasn't even directly related to the next generation spacecraft. Healthcare, right now on the International Space Station, we do all kind of medical experiments looking for the next big breakthrough. And it's funny, we talk about complacency. My friend Lonnie Dutre, who is the director at Michaud, he likes to say, yeah, well, if we go to the moon and find a cure for cancer, there are going to be a lot of people wanting to go to the moon. So, I mean, little things like that come up, and our basic quality of life with robotics. We have done so much in robotics in the International Space Station because we have to assemble this thing in space. We can't always have human beings out there turning wrenches. And it has helped us to come up with, like, for instance, legs for humans who can't walk. These are the kind of things that the technology has spun off. And I couldn't be more proud than that to work for NASA.
It is amazing. It's transformative, and so you really began to bore down on the communication systems and all of that, and the rest of your career in NASA sort of played out in that domain, didn't it?
Well, actually, it's funny, not really. As I said, every 3 years, right? Well, while I was in the audio group, they needed people to sit in what was known as the mission evaluation room. And in that room is the think tank. And if you saw Apollo 13, those were the guys that came in and said, we can make this round peg fit this square hole. And that's the team of people that I was a part of, not for Apollo 13. That was way before me. But we solved the problems on the International Space Station that the flight plan didn't address. Well, fast forward, I got the phone call that we needed to build that capability with the Russians to manage the space station, and they wanted me to do it. So I spent many weeks in Russia working with their teams. I spent many hours working with the shuttle guys trying to figure out what's the best way to do it. And we built the entire processes that are followed today as the backroom engineers for the International Space Station. That took my career in a whole different direction.
Mark, it's so interesting to hear. You know, when I had gotten sort of a briefing on you before our last conversation, a lot of that was not in there. So it's interesting that we're having this conversation now. But you know what's cool about if you go back in your career, and I'm not surprised that you ended up getting put on a team helping to solve problems because, first of all, what you had evolved into a communications sort of expert that has connections to just about every system in the craft and on the land in terms of monitoring. All the work that you had done in terms of computer and developing systems it really puts you in a great position to be, as I say on the show all the time, kind of a jack of all trades, a problem solver.
Yes, and I think that's what I love the most. Sometimes my wife tells me, look, you don't have a problem to solve here. So when I don't have a problem to solve, everything's a problem to solve. But I'm getting better at that at my ripe old age. Anyway, communication and data seems to be almost everything in the space business. And I did have a great background in that. And, you know, we had a saying in the MER, in God we trust, all others bring data. We did not allow for opinions to shape the solutions we came up with. You had to back it up with real facts and data.
Yeah, it was interesting. You know, when the space shuttle blew up, on takeoff, coming out of Florida, and we got to studying the data as it related to the cold day. It was interesting because I went through a case study on that, and you know, it all depends on how you look at the data. So many lessons came from that, didn't it? About, you know, we've got to bore down even more. We have to understand how often did that O-ring fail when it got below a certain temperature. And you know, it's interesting. From the failures, you have to learn. You have to use those as incredible, like compelling cases for moving the ball forward. But even in that analysis, data ruled the day, didn't it?
Yeah, and it's interesting. I spent the last year of my NASA career on a special assignment for the administrator to look at the failures we had had in the past, some that were catastrophic, some that we averted, and see what it was about each one of those that led us to get better at it. I'd be remiss if I didn't bring up an EVA incident that most people didn't even know about, where water got in the helmet, and we almost made a mistake that day when we assumed that the drink bottle was causing the issue, when in reality it was another problem, and we sent the astronaut back out. He did make it back, but we were very fortunate that day.
So much to learn. Stennis is so important. NASA's role at Stennis, the communication that goes on between Stennis and Huntsville, for example. I used to have responsibility for the newspaper in Huntsville and admired greatly what they've accomplished there with their partners and at the base there in Huntsville. When we come back, we'll continue our conversation with Mark Glorioso and talk about the future. Welcome back to Coast Vue. You know, I say this a lot. Some of the best conversations happen when we're not on the air. You know, in fact, I wish that the conversation that Mark and I just had, Mark Glorioso, who's the chairman of Partners for Stennis and Michaud, we were just kind of sharing notes on how we learned as young kids and how we sort of instilled what we learned in our kids and how they've been able to achieve as a result of that. But it was just fun. It was that we probably ought to come back one day, Mark, and have that conversation on air, because I think it really reflects what a lot of people have gone through in their lives. People have various different kinds of learning disabilities, but when they really overcome it, those who are able to can really achieve amazing things in their life. And what you've done at NASA, what you did at NASA, was really important. Hey, listen, this show has been about trying to bring some focus to Stennis, and your organization is a great way to do that. Your experience, having been able to see these evolutions over so many years, is a great way to do it. I'm going to have you back over and over again as we continue to bore down on all these various missions that exist inside Stennis. Like, for example, oceanography and what's happening in that realm at Stennis is unbelievable. I remember when I was publisher of the newspaper and went to Stennis for the first time and saw some of the supercomputers that are playing out there. It's just unbelievable work. And we can take whole shows talking about all this stuff. But, you know, when you think about, you know, we talked a little bit about the future of Stennis. We talked a little bit about the future of NASA and how that plays out. How do you talk about the future of Stennis within that context?
Well, it's interesting. I hadn't even gotten in my discussion of my career to when I came to Stennis yet. So there's much more. But let me go back to your question. I see that a lot of this playing out in Stennis Space Center continuing to grow as it has. I don't think many of your listeners know that NASA is about a 28% presence at Stennis Space Center. Obviously, it was 100% when we opened the doors. The Navy has a 38% presence. So we have more Navy going on than we have NASA. There is the Department of Commerce, which is down around 3.5%, but those are some of the supercomputers and the big data center out there at Stennis Space Center. And then you've got another 27% of just every other kind of company, commercial space. There's Rolls-Royce, as I mentioned, testing their engines. And it's interesting that our impact is about $1.3 billion. And that's 5,000 employees. That's $109,000 annual salary. This is not minimum wage work. And it's about $190 million tax contribution to the state of Mississippi. It's a top 10 employer. It is 10,000 jobs indirectly, and 74 cents out of every dollar that goes to Stennis is spent in our local economy. So I kind of answered your question, but it says we got to not be complacent because of these statistics. And we need to consider that the future is going to be very commercially oriented and very military oriented.
Well, I think that what a great way sort of to answer the question by talking about what was 100% NASA when this first started, really focused around the mission to the moon, et cetera, evolved into a very diversified workforce, both governmental entities and private sector. And, I suggest to you, this obviously goes without saying, but the number of private sector employees, private sector companies engaged, that will continue to get diversified as we go forward, because innovation is going to happen. We don't even know what it is now. Innovation is going to happen. It's going to cause all kinds of twists and turns that create opportunities for Stennis to thrive. But when you think of over $1 billion impact, my friend, you think about what Ingalls is doing. You think about what Chevron is doing, all the ancillary businesses that thrive off of their existence. And then you come over to Stennis and you realize what is happening at Stennis and the amount of ancillary economic growth and pulsation that comes out of that. That is the reason why I call them bookends. On one end, you got Jackson County, the other, you got Hancock. These are incredible bookends to what is the economic engine for Mississippi. It's undeniable, and we can't take it for granted, can we, my friend?
Absolutely not. And I want to throw in that NASA is about 1/2 of every cent that the federal government spends. And that's not Stennis, that's the entire agency. We need NASA for a lot of reasons.
Yeah, boy, do we. Oh, my gosh, do we. I look forward to in future shows as we kind of drill down a little bit. And through you, you can introduce me to some of the heads of some of these companies that are really, on the cutting edge as it relates to commercial space flight. I'm reminded, even though I talk a lot about the military in coastal Mississippi, I talk about what's happening relative to the military at Stennis, but I probably ought to get some leaders from the Navy at Stennis to really talk about their important work. Because, man, they're hitting on a bunch of cylinders there. I know that. But, Mark, we're out of time for the day, but it has been a pleasure to catch back up with you, my friend.
And as well. And I look forward to coming back and talking more about my specifics at Stennis.
Yeah. No doubt about it. This has been Mark Glorioso, the chairman of Partners for Stennis and Michaud. And I think we'll have a long association between Mark and Coast Vue and myself as we continue to bore down on making sure no one can take Stennis Space Center for granted. Have a great day, and we'll see you tomorrow.